Hello everyone and welcome back. Today I am going to do the first video in a new series that I'm trying to put together that is called the Fantasy Masterclass series. So basically what I would like to do, because I think this would be a good way to increase engagement and to get to hear from a lot of you, is to have a conversation about the various aspects of fantasy novels that make them great. So today what I want to do for the first video is talk about characterization. So which fantasy authors do I think create the best characters, which characters echo in my mind, which characters live on and feel real and make me stop and think about them weeks or months after I've finished reading the books that they are a part of. I chose characters to do first because characters are the thing that I like the most about novels. This is the easiest topic for me to talk about because good characters will always stick out to me above an atmospheric setting or a fast-paced plot or very intricate world building. And so I thought that this would make the best topic to start us off. I would just like to say that this isn't a ranking. It isn't the people that I think are necessarily the best in the genre. These are the authors that I have experienced who I feel do an exceptional job with characters. And what I'm hoping is to hear from all of you so that you can offer me some recommendations for authors who you also think create realistic, believable, fascinating characters who stick with you long after you have finished reading about them. So I'm going to talk about 5 authors who I feel like construct the most, the most realistic, the most interesting, the most well-constructed characters in fantasy. And I will start off with probably the author that everybody expects to be on this list, and that is Joe Abercrombie. I think Joe Abercrombie's strength in creating characters is how distinctive they all feel from one another. When you are reading a book by Joe Abercrombie, you can open it, and I believe this is something that I heard Philip Chase say in one of his videos, and I just paused and thought, like, that is so true. That is a very astute observation. He has the ability to write characters in a way that you know instantaneously who is on the page. You can pick up one of the books from the First Law trilogy and you know without looking at the character tags if you are seeing things from Logan's perspective, or if this is Giselle who's talking, or if Glokta is on the page. And this is outside just knowing about the characters. This is the way that they speak, their dialects, the content of their dialogue, their internal monologues, the fears that they have, the little things that they say to themselves in their minds to help them try to get through the next fight or the next day. They have such distinctive minds and distinctive personalities, and it takes a truly talented author to pull that off. Writing believable characters is difficult in and of itself, but writing believable characters who feel so unique and so distinctive from one another is even just a step above, and I really admire Abercrombie's ability to do that. I think having other skills is definitely helpful. I think that Abercrombie's dialogue is very witty, it's very to the point, and that definitely makes the characters come to life. You could be very psychologically minded, but if your dialogue falls flat, or if you're trying to be funny and you just don't reach that level of humor, it can have a serious impact on the way that you create your character. But I think because Abercrombie is such a talented writer, you don't get bogged down by his action sequences. His very direct prose helps propel the action forward. His dialogue is spot on for each of the characters. And beyond that, he does have that ability to psychologically examine his characters and build them up in a way that feels very fresh and true to life. He creates these characters with flaws that make sense based on the things that have happened to them in the past, based on the events that have transpired in their lives. And their actions can be connected to those either early traumas or early relationships, and you can see how the history that Abercrombie has built for his characters has led them down the path that they take in the novels that they are in. These are all elements that are needed to create such gritty and realistic characters, and it's something that I think Joe Abercrombie does very well. Because of the themes and the tone of the First Law novels, another thing that makes these characters feel very fresh is the fact that they are all painted in these shades of gray. You do not have your typical hero archetype. You do not have your villain who is easy to hate. You have people who have undergone experiences that have made them do some really awful things, and you have situations that are created by Joe Abercrombie that put these characters in a position where they have to choose the better of two horrible options. They don't always get the opportunity to be heroic, and in fact, when some of them try, it just beats them back. They are taught very quickly that sometimes, and in some worlds, there is no place for heroism. And again, I think that it can be easy to dip down into that extreme nihilism that just makes you want to give up and think, what's the point of even reading this? These characters are all awful. There's nothing redeemable. I hate them. And at least for me, that has never happened while reading in the world of the First Law. I think that Joe Abercrombie straddles that line perfectly. I think that the characters are nuanced and complex enough that despite the fact that you might want to shake them sometimes, you never stop rooting for them to succeed, even if you know that their success means another character's pain or downfall. And it's definitely a strange place to be in, even as a reader, because the actions that they take often go against what I assume are the morals for most people who are reading these books. But Joe Abercrombie makes you understand these characters and makes you want to feel for them. So for all of those reasons, I think that Abercrombie is certainly a master of his craft and one of the kings of the character-driven novel. The next author that I have placed on my personal list, and an author whose work I enjoy above all others because of his character development, is Stephen King. So I have been reading Stephen King since I was a very young child, and I have enjoyed what I have read in all of his kind of subgenres of writing. So the books of his that are more fantasy oriented, like The Dark Tower, and even I would argue The Stand, The Eyes of the Dragon. I enjoy some of his horror novels, although some of the really scary ones I still haven't read. His books that are more crime focused, or even the ones that feel a little more slice of life. He definitely has versatility. I think people obviously know him as the king of horror, but his skills and his ability to craft characters transcends that horror genre. I think one of the things that makes Stephen King such a good crafter of characters is the fact that he is not afraid to write the parts of ourselves that we wish weren't there. His characters grapple with thoughts, with actions, with pasts that most authors and most people, I think, would like to sweep under the rug. There are thoughts that his characters have that as you're reading them, they feel so disturbing and so frightening that you want to push away from that. But I also think that if many of us are being honest, some of these thoughts and some of these patterns of thinking are things that we could probably identify with. Stephen King taps into the part of us, that id-fueled, monstrous part of all of us as humans that we try to stifle, that we try to rise above. And I obviously don't think that some of his most horrific antisocial characters, I don't think that we are like that, but I think that there are elements to everyone that toe that line of darkness. And Stephen King has this way of bringing that out in his characters, even the characters who are the heroes of his stories, of bringing that to the surface and making them feel real by virtue of the acknowledgement of that darkness of human nature. It is something that's uncomfortable to talk about. It's something that we don't want to always admit, but I think that it's something that is there. And I think his uncaring attitude, the way that he is not afraid to push the limit, is something that makes him a great character author. Beyond that, when you get beyond what I feel is his forte, so reaching down into that psychological darkness, Stephen King also is one of the most talented authors that I have read in terms of constructing a character who fits their age range. So King writes a variety of age ranges in his stories. He has many coming of age novels. He writes about young people. He writes about middle-aged people. He has written books about the elderly or elderly characters. And to me, whatever age range he's writing, the characters feel very true to their age and their circumstances in life. And this is easy to see, and it's highlighted really well in the Dark Tower books, because in the quartet, or in the group of characters who are questing towards the tower, you have characters who are kind of at the upper end of older middle age. You have characters who are young, who start off in their 20s, and then you have characters who are children. And the way that these characters react to situations, the way that they draw on past experiences, the way that they do or do not give in to their emotions feels very true to the decade of life that they're in. And again, I think that this is something that takes a lot of talent. There are many books that I have read, both in the young adult genres and in the adult genres, where the tone starts to get a little bit skewed and your experience of the story starts to get skewed, because in the case of young adult, you might be reading about characters who are 15 or 16, but who talk and act and react in ways that feels like they're in their 20s or their 30s. And similarly, you'll read, and I find this sometimes in adult romance, for example, you'll read characters who are 25 or 30 and react to situations like teenagers or people who are much younger. And this can be the case in fantasy as well. It's hard to hit that stride, because some authors obviously are younger and they haven't had the lived experience to write the older characters in a way that feels true to life. Or authors may be older and they don't quite identify with their teenage years in the same way. And when we look back and we reflect on our earlier lives, I think sometimes we impose the knowledge and the wisdom that we have gained as older adults onto the people that we were. And that kind of changes our interpretation even of ourselves as younger people. And that in turn makes it difficult to write about people who are younger or people who are in a different stage of life. But through some magic, Stephen King is able to write characters that feel very true to their age, that speak the ways that people of that age speak, that act the ways that people of that age act. And I think that that is another element that makes his characters come to life. And finally, similarly to Joe Abercrombie, I think that Stephen King just writes dialogue very well. His dialogue is less of the fantastic and more of the everyday man, the modern person, but he is able to integrate the kind of modern slang and vernacular in a way that really makes his dialogue pop. Stephen King is very quotable. There are parts of each of his novels that kind of stick in your head. There are lines from The Stand, for example, from certain characters that have stuck with me and that I sometimes will drop into everyday conversation because they're so catchy. He writes such catchy dialogue, and that dialogue in turn makes his characters feel very real. The third author that I would like to talk about and kind of offer up as a master of creating characters is Robin Hobb. Now, I haven't gotten very far in the realm of the Elderlings. I have only read the Farseer trilogy, but I feel confident saying this because I hear from a lot of people that Farseer is Hobb at her weakest, and considering how much I loved that trilogy, I'm excited to read on. But I've also read and heard from other people that her characterization continues to improve. She makes richer secondary characters the further along you go in her series, and I don't think that this is something that changes. So I feel comfortable and confident putting her on this list. And to be honest, even if I never read anything except Farseer, I was so impressed by her construction of Fitz that she would make this list anyway. So when I think of Robin Hobb and the element to her character building that I feel makes her a master is the psychological complexity of her characters. So I'm going to talk about Fitz in particular because the Farseer trilogy really is focused on Fitz. And what we get of the other characters, because Fitz is an unreliable narrator, is his interpretation of them. And sometimes that can paint them in ways that makes them seem very one-dimensional. Sometimes we get a richer exploration of their character, but I feel like all of this hinges on the fact that we are following Fitz and we are interpreting people based on the light in which he sees them. But to just focus on Fitz, what I really admired about Hobb's writing and her construction of this character is how every element of his personality and the choices he made, the person he became, the actions that he followed through on as an adult, all stemmed from experiences in his earlier life. I think Hobb had a great command of what can happen to children who lose the secure attachment of a parent, who are thrust into an unknown and in a lot of ways unsafe environment and have to fend for themselves and try to establish relationships and carve out a place where they will feel safe. And I think as the series progresses, and I will keep this spoiler free, I think that we see the reverberations of the traumatic events that Fitz endures and the things that have been done to him or around him and how that impacts the types of decisions that he makes. We see through a variety of the secondary characters such as Burrich, Patience, Molly, we see the various facets of Fitz's personality come to life. We see in turn his insecurity. We see his stubbornness. We see his capacity to be thoughtful and gentle. And these all come out in various ways. And in a lot of ways, they come out through these relationships that he builds. Hobb does not shy away from the parts of Fitz's personality that are less appealing. His, as I said before, his stubbornness, sometimes he can be very impulsive. It is very difficult for him to take advice, for him to trust people. And again, I like how all of this echoes back to the events of his early childhood, to the things that have brought him into the kingdom of the Seven Duchies, the things that have put him on this kind of royal scale, have uprooted him from his life. You can see how those impact his relationship with those at court, with those around him, and the decisions that he makes. Robin Hobb also does a great job of integrating mental health into the story in a way that feels very organic. I know that writing about mental health is something that people like to do a lot now, which is great. Obviously, the more representation we get, the more we can break down barriers and stigma. But as with a lot of the things that she writes, Robin Hobb writes struggles with mental health in a way that feels very organic to the story. There's no soapboxing. There's no asking to be patted on the back for including this in her story. She acknowledges that this is just an aspect of Fitz's personality, of his psyche, and she also portrays his struggles with mental illness in a way that feels very true to life. When Fitz is depressed, he is irritable. He is lashing out. He is not fun to be around. He is a character that you just want to get angry at. And unfortunately, those are characteristics when people are feeling really down, when they have been through a lot, that doesn't always come out in ways that garner instant sympathy. It's why there is such a stigma against mental health. When you're not feeling well, when you are depressed, when you're going through a major depressive episode, it's not always feeling sad and being isolated. Sometimes it is lashing out at others. It's not believing that people have your best interests, that you're not worthy of the good affection or attention of the people that are around you. And that can lead you to push people away. And Robin Hobb really integrates that into Fitz's story. His struggles, specifically in the conclusion to the trilogy, are really difficult to read about. You know that he's in pain, and you can see why he's pushing away the people that he cares about, but you also feel really frustrated. And being able to elicit that depth of emotion is a testament to how talented Hobb is in terms of her character writing. I felt everything for Fitz. I felt happy for him at times. I felt sad for him, heartbroken, frustrated, angry. The whole range of emotions were out in terms of reading about Fitz, and it made him one of the most complex and one of the most realistic characters that I have ever read about in my 30 plus years of reading fantasy novels. The fourth author that I would like to highlight in terms of character development is John Gwynne. So John Gwynne has become my new fantasy obsession, along with a lot of people on BookTube. His books are so readable. They're so readable. You can flip through them in a day. They're big, but they're so action-packed, and they're so exciting that you can just flip through them, like I said, so quickly. I have now read all of the books that he has available, and I'm really sad because this is the first time since I picked up Malice in February that I have had to go without having any new John Gwynne, and that is very disappointing to me. But John Gwynne writes characters that you fall in love with. Like I said, he's very action-oriented. These are very plot-focused books. There's a lot of twists and turns and reveals. But at the heart of all of his works, his Faithful and the Fallen Quartet, the Of Blood and Bone trilogy, and then his newest release, there are characters that you can really root for. His construction of characters is a little different than the authors I have already talked about, because I think the reason that we love them comes less from the psychological complexity and more from the depth of their emotion and their relationships with other characters. John Gwynne's characters have more heart than any other fantasy characters that I have ever read. You want to cheer for them. You get so invested in their stories. And the villains, you love to hate them. When they're on the page, you're like, oh, I can't believe you're doing this. You're so mad and so frustrated, and it's so fun. If you can't tell, I had such a good time while I was reading these books. And I think that John Gwynne just knows how to pull those emotions out of you. There are some of the characters that are a little more complex than others. Veritas from the Faithful and the Fallen trilogy, I think was a really well done character. I particularly enjoyed Bleda in the Of Blood and Bone trilogy, and I really liked some of the characters, but I won't mention them yet, from his newest novel as well. But again, when I think about Gwynne's novels, I don't necessarily think of them in terms of their psychological complexity, but more about how human they are. They forge such strong bonds with each other. Friendship, parenthood, siblinghood, all of these things are really important to John Gwynne's characters. And they are flawed. Even his main character in The Faithful and the Fallen, Corbin, to me could have become a very generic fantasy hero, but I think that Gwynne was able to eschew those common traps and problems with that kind of heroic archetype and create a character who feels very real. Corbin has fears. He starts off as someone who is clearly second-guessing his abilities, second-guessing his bravery, The fear in the face of battle is a really common theme in John Gwyn's novels, and his heroes are not always courageous. They're not always able to follow through on their skills, and sometimes their hesitation and their inability to react or act quickly leads to the death of people that they care about. There are really high stakes in these novels, and sometimes it's because of the characters' shortcomings that really bad things happen. Sometimes people make the wrong decision, and that echoes throughout the entire series, and I really like that about his characters. But I will say that for me, what makes them stand out and what makes them feel realistic, and I guess beyond realism, what makes them feel like characters who I want to root for, is just the pure heart that's put in there. There are too many characters that I love in these series to even name them all. I feel like I could do a video on my favorite characters from just the Banished Lands universe. But these are characters whose depth of emotion will pull those emotions out of you. I cried more for these characters than I have for fantasy characters, maybe ever. His books, even though they definitely fit a certain type of fantasy, and sometimes you know a direction that a character is taking, you're still so invested. You love and hate these characters in equal measure, and I think that that makes John Gwyn an incredibly talented writer. The fifth and final author that I would like to talk about in this video is the only young adult author who made it onto this list, and that is Maggie Stiefvater, who has written several young adult fantasy series, probably the best known of which is the Raven Cycle. So these are novels that focus on students who go to an elite kind of preparatory academy, and a girl who's from much lower means who becomes their friend and kind of gets absorbed into their group. And Maggie Stiefvater, these books, first of all, are some of my favorite YA fantasy books, but her ability to create nuanced and complex characters, I think, is unrivaled in YA fiction. These are far and above all of the other character-driven YA stories that I have read. And I think that Maggie Stiefvater is just a very talented writer in general. A lot of the strengths that I have talked about from these other authors, Maggie Stiefvater does very well as well. She has an understanding of psychological complexity that outshines a lot of the other authors that I have read. She tackles topics such as childhood abuse, such as physically abusive parents. She talks about socioeconomic differences and how that can impact your interactions with your friends and the way that you go about your daily life. And with using those techniques and using her understanding of people and the way that they live in the world, she has created a cast of characters, especially in her Raven Cycle, that is unparalleled in almost any of the fantasy that I have read. The characters in that novel are so richly drawn that they feel real. They are some of the most realistic characters that I have ever read. I buy anything that she puts out now because I was so impressed with the quality of both her writing and her character development, and I want to experience any of the novels that she puts out. So those are the 5 authors who I feel contribute greatly to the realm of character-driven fantasy. I think that their characters are complex, rich, easy to root for, and they're authors who I will always trust to create characters who feel real to me. I would love to hear your thoughts on the characterization of these authors. I would love to hear your thoughts on which fantasy authors you think build up the best characters. These were all fairly popular and well-known authors, so I will try to move away from that beaten path in some of the future topics that I'm going to discuss. But if you have any authors who are kind of hidden gems or who are not talked about as much on BookTube, who you feel create complex and interesting characters, then feel free to let me know below. I would love to hear all of your thoughts, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye.